When Richard Blake discarded an old book, he had no idea that this simple act would open doors to long-hidden secrets. From social injustice to personal tragedies, the book, found by a homeless man, would return to overturn his life and shatter everything he believed in. What happened next would shock even those used to the worst. But let's start from the beginning. Richard Blake embodied the kind of success millions dream of, but only a few attain. He built an empire from scratch, becoming one of the most influential people in his field, and naturally, his surroundings matched his status. Lavish mansions, luxury cars, and priceless works of art. These were all integral parts of his daily life. He collected paintings, sculptures, rare books, but for him, they were more symbols of status than objects of personal meaning. He didn't care about the artistic or historical value of these items. To him, they were simply luxurious objects that confirmed his exceptional place in society. One day, at an exclusive auction, Richard purchased a rare 18th century book. It was a unique item, a hefty leather-bound volume with gold lettering on the cover and worn pages that carried the essence of antiquity. Someone had told him that this book was a true rarity and that owning it would highlight his refined taste. Richard barely glanced at it before placing it on a shelf in his office among other artifacts. For him, it was just another item meant to impress guests and partners, its value measured solely in monetary terms. Years passed, and Blake's office filled with new, valuable things, none of which he truly cared about. With each new purchase, Richard felt more anxious and irritated, as if his life had become trapped in soulless luxury. All the splendor had ceased to bring him joy, and one day, after a particularly bad business day, he felt the need to rid himself of unnecessary clutter. His office shelves were bursting with collectibles, and he decided it was time for a purge. When his gaze landed on that very old book, he felt no regret. It seemed to him to be nothing more than another object taking up space in his office. At that moment, all Richard cared about was getting rid of these dust collectors and making room for something new. He didn't even think about the possibility that the book might have some special history or value. In a fit of irritation, he grabbed it off the shelf and, without a second thought, threw it away. For him, this act was as simple and routine as tossing out an old newspaper. Books, like anything else, had meaning for him only as long as they brought profit. Richard was not a sentimental person. He didn't believe that objects could carry any spiritual or personal value unless they were tied to direct outcomes, whether money, influence, or power. With this decision, he felt a brief sense of relief. The book was gone, no longer part of his life. Once again, he could feel like the master of his space, not a prisoner of things that no longer brought him joy. But fate has a strange sense of humor, and its twists can sometimes be unexpected. A few years later, at an event where Richard mingled with influential people and made new investments, he happened to overhear the name of that very book. Someone was telling an incredible story about how an old book, found in a landfill, had changed someone's life. At first, Richard didn't pay much attention, but then something flickered in his memory. The story reminded him of the day he threw away that old volume without even looking at its contents. With each passing minute, the realization crept in, like a weight he couldn't shake off. And then he understood. The book they were talking about was the very one he had discarded. This discovery stunned him. How could a book he thought worthless play such a pivotal role in someone else's life? This moment made him reconsider how fleeting decisions can profoundly affect other people. The book Richard threw away didn't vanish into the trash heap, as he had assumed. Its fate turned out to be far more unusual and consequential than the millionaire, who had casually discarded it, could have imagined. When the old book ended up among the scattered junk, it was found by someone for whom it became much more than just a dusty volume. Samuel, a former literature professor, was the lucky person who stumbled upon this ancient tome while searching for something that could offer him even a small benefit in his desperate state. Samuel had once been a respected professor at a university. He taught literature and loved his work, dedicated to the books and knowledge they carried. But when an economic crisis hit his country, Samuel lost everything: his job, his home, his savings. Left homeless, he fell into depression and despair. Life on the streets was unbearable, and each new day brought more pain and emptiness. It seemed there was no hope of returning to normal life. One day, while rummaging through a dump in search of something edible or remotely useful, his gaze fell upon the book. It looked quite tattered and dirty, but something about its ancient binding caught his eye. Samuel carefully picked it up, brushing the dust off its cover. To his surprise, he discovered that the book wasn't just old, but a true literary treasure. He knew he was holding something unique, something that had once been worth a fortune. But for him, at that moment, the book represented much more than its material value. He brought it to his temporary shelter, a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, where Samuel had been staying for the past few weeks. There, by the light of the moon and candles, he began carefully cleaning its pages, trying to preserve as much of the original text as possible. Every evening, despite his fatigue and hunger, he spent time studying the book, immersing himself in its lines, which seemed to restore his lost sense of purpose and strength. With each page he read, it was as if he was returning to his old world, a world of knowledge, culture, and literature. Gradually, his mental state began to improve. The book became a symbol of hope, a bridge between his past and present. It helped him remember who he had been before he lost everything. Samuel began to rediscover his old passion, literature. He started reflecting on texts again, analyzing styles, and forming thoughts that he had long since left behind. Over time, he even began sharing his knowledge with other homeless people on the streets, those who, like him, had hit rock bottom. He organized impromptu lessons right on the streets. Gathering people around, he would read them excerpts from the book and discuss its content. These meetings began to attract not only the homeless, but also passers-by. Gradually, word of the street professor spread through the area. For those who came to listen, he wasn't just a man with a past, but a true teacher, capable of inspiring and awakening in people an interest in literature, art, and culture, despite their difficult circumstances. The book Richard had deemed absolutely worthless became Samuel's salvation. It gave him not only a reason to live, but also a renewed sense of self-worth. Restoring it, Samuel had also restored his own soul. And though the book had been discarded as a useless object, it turned out to be the catalyst that brought Samuel back to life and gave him new meaning. Years passed. Richard Blake became increasingly absorbed in endless deals, projects, and bigger ambitions. His company thrived, signing multi-million-dollar contracts, expanding internationally, and everything concerning his personal life became shrouded in a dense fog of financial metrics and business meetings. As is often the case with people of his stature, Richard simply had no time for the little things that once might have seemed important. Among those little things was the old book he had tossed in the trash years ago. It had long faded from his memory, just like countless other things he had so easily discarded. One day, Richard received an invitation to a charity event. These kinds of gatherings were nothing unusual for him. They were opportunities to maintain connections in high society and show himself in a good light to influential people. That evening followed the usual script: smiles, conversations, donations, and polite small talk. Richard was among those who didn't pay much attention to the speeches, focusing instead on networking. However, his attention was suddenly drawn to one of the speakers. A man took the stage whose name was already known to many in the audience: Samuel Bronson. Once homeless, Samuel was now a renowned educator and a popular public figure who inspired others through his personal story. His journey, full of pain, falls, and unexpected salvation, had touched the hearts of many people. Samuel began his speech by recounting how he ended up on the streets, lost everything, and how it seemed like there was no hope of returning to a normal life. But then his voice grew stronger, and the room fell into absolute silence. At that very moment, when I was ready to give up, fate handed me an unexpected gift: an old book I found in a landfill, Samuel said, his voice trembling with memories. That book brought me back to life. It reminded me of who I was, of my calling. I restored it, as if restoring my own soul. And thanks to that artifact, I was able to return to teaching, to the life I thought I had lost. Richard, who had been only half listening before, suddenly became alert. His heart started to race when Samuel mentioned the book. Something about this story seemed familiar. He looked closely at Samuel, trying to piece together what he had heard. What artifact? Thought Richard, struggling to remember the details. An old book? From the landfill? This book, published in the 18th century, became a symbol of my salvation, Samuel continued. It was discarded by someone who deemed it worthless, but for me, it was a lifeline. I preserved it, and now it's a part of my life and work. When Samuel mentioned the title of the book, Richard felt a chill run down his spine. His mind flashed back to the day when he threw away that very book. This couldn't be a coincidence. The same book he had once cast aside without a second thought had ended up in the hands of a man whose life was transformed by that worthless artifact. Richard sat frozen in place, stunned. It seemed impossible that such an insignificant decision on his part could have played such a major role in someone else's life. Just minutes earlier, he had been confident in himself, believing that he controlled his life and influenced others through business and deals. But now, listening to Samuel, he began to realize how little he understood about the real value of things and how easily he had dismissed what truly mattered. The room erupted in applause as Samuel finished his speech, but Richard didn't hear it. He was lost in his thoughts, grappling with the unexpected realization that his actions, however trivial they might seem at first glance, could have far-reaching consequences he had never imagined. From that moment on, he could no longer view his life and his impact on others the same way he had before. After the speech ended, Richard couldn't shake off the thoughts racing through his mind. The evening, which he had expected to be just another typical charity event, had turned into something far more significant. Samuel's story haunted him. He couldn't rid himself of the feeling that this was no coincidence, but rather a sign, a message from fate. Richard, usually calm and in control of every situation, now felt uneasy. He had to speak with Samuel. This thought wouldn't leave him. Without waiting for the end of the event, he began looking for a chance to meet the man who had so unexpectedly shaken his worldview. In the crowd surrounding Samuel with congratulations and words of support, Richard finally found a moment to approach him. "Excuse me, could I have a moment?" Richard asked cautiously, feeling his voice waver slightly. Samuel turned and met his gaze with a warm smile. His eyes held the wisdom and calm of someone who had walked through the darkest moments of life. "Of course. How can I help?" Samuel replied, looking at Richard with polite curiosity. I heard your speech. What you said. The book you found. I can't believe it, but I think it's the same book that I threw away. It's incredible," Richard almost stammered, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and awkwardness. He was used to being the center of attention, but now he felt out of place. This was an entirely new feeling for him. Samuel looked at him intently, as if trying to catch something important in his words. "So that was your book?" Samuel asked quietly, his tone soft and without judgment. Richard nodded, unsure of what to say next. He felt guilty, though he couldn't quite explain why. After all, it was just an object he had discarded without a second thought. "Yes, I threw it away years ago. I don't even remember why. It seemed useless to me, just one of those things that accumulate over time. I never read it, and it was nothing special to me," Richard admitted, then added with a hint of sadness, "Now I realize how wrong I was." Samuel smiled, but there was no sarcasm or reproach in it, only understanding. "I can see why you might have done that. For you, it was just another item among many. But for me, it became a symbol. When I found it, I was at my lowest point. I had nothing. No home, no job, no hope. I picked it up from the dump, not knowing what to do with it. But slowly, that book, its words and pages, began to bring me back to life. Through it, I reconnected with the world I had lost," Samuel explained, his voice filled with sincerity, and Richard couldn't help but be moved by his words. "That's unbelievable," Richard murmured, still struggling to grasp what he had just heard. He couldn't understand how a book he had deemed worthless could play such a pivotal role in someone else's fate. You know, Samuel continued, it taught me a lesson. I realized that sometimes the things we consider unimportant or useless can become salvation for others. We don't always see the true value of what we have. That book wasn't just an artifact for me. It was a symbol of hope and inner strength. It gave me a reason to live again, a purpose, and a chance to be a teacher once more. For Richard, these words hit like a thunderbolt. He had always approached life from a place of logic and profit. Everything he owned was subject to a clear system of values. If it didn't bring profit or benefit, it had no worth. But now, he realized how narrow his perspective had been. He had always viewed the world through the lens of money and power, never considering that even seemingly useless things could have profound meaning for others. This encounter made Richard reflect on how lightly he had taken so many aspects of his life. A new awareness began to take root in his mind, that material value was just one side of the coin. Perhaps, deep inside, there was room for understanding that not everything could be measured by money, and that sometimes the smallest, seemingly insignificant decisions could alter the course of someone's life. As they said their goodbyes, Richard felt something he had never experienced before, a sense of humility before the things he couldn't control, and a deep gratitude for the lesson he had learned that evening. The realization that his careless act of discarding an old book had profoundly impacted another person's life stirred something deep within Richard Blake, something that had long been dormant beneath the weight of his wealth. This awareness burrowed so deeply into his mind that he couldn't remain the same. All his life, Richard had prided himself on his rationality, his ability to see the world through numbers, deals, and contracts. But now that framework had collapsed, leaving him to confront a more complex question. What role did he really play in the world, and how did his decisions affect the lives of others? That night, after meeting Samuel, Richard couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his enormous, almost empty mansion, surrounded by countless luxury items that now seemed utterly pointless to him. He tried to reconcile his old world view with this new understanding, that even the smallest, seemingly insignificant decisions could be pivotal in someone else's destiny. In that moment, Richard realized that his life had been dedicated to the pursuit of material wealth, but all that wealth couldn't fill the inner void he felt. The next morning, once his thoughts had cleared, Richard made a firm decision. He couldn't leave this realization at the level of understanding. He had to act. His life had been filled with too many moments driven by logic and money, and far too few moments where he truly helped others without expecting anything in return. He reached out to Samuel, offering to help create a charitable foundation. It was not only a response to his conscience, but a desire to do something meaningful, something that could give Richard a sense of real purpose in his life. When they met again, Samuel was surprised to see how genuine Richard's intentions were. The man who had once viewed books and other artifacts as mere status symbols and investments now stood before him with an entirely different attitude. "Samuel," Richard began, unsure of how to fully express his thoughts, "I can't stop thinking about what happened. That book I threw away, thinking it was worthless, changed your life, and it made me realize that in the world I've built around myself, I completely lost sight of what really matters." "I'm glad that book played its part," Samuel replied, his eyes smiling gently. "But its role in my life was only possible because I was searching for salvation. We all make mistakes, Richard, and the point isn't that you discarded the book. The point is that you want to change something now. That's far more important." Richard nodded, absorbing Samuel's words. "I want to do more," he said firmly. "I propose we start a foundation that helps those in tough situations. We wouldn't just hand out money, but we'd help people rebuild their lives through education, work, housing. You could lead this project." Samuel was astonished by the offer, but in his heart, he felt it was exactly what he had been seeking. Ever since finding that book, his journey had been about restoring himself and helping others, and now he had the opportunity to do this on a much larger scale. "That's incredible," Samuel said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "This could change so many lives, and if we can give people not just money, but knowledge and skills, that would be real support. It would give people a true second chance. The idea of the foundation started to take shape within months. Richard invested significant funds into the project, but for him, this wasn't just another financial contribution. It was something much more. He realized that this step not only helped others, but also helped him reframe his role in society. The foundation began with a few small support programs for the homeless and underprivileged. Samuel became the face and heart of the project, sharing his story and inspiring others not to lose hope, no matter how dire their circumstances. Over time, the foundation grew, gaining attention not only in local circles but on a national level. People heard stories about how, thanks to the foundation's help, individuals were returning to normal life, gaining new skills, finding housing, and becoming productive members of society again. Samuel's story became a symbol of how even the most unexpected and seemingly insignificant moments could change a person's life. For Richard, this marked the beginning of his own transformation. He began to reflect more on how his actions, both large and small, impacted others. His approach to business started to change. He now placed more focus on projects that could benefit society, not just generate profit. He spent more time talking with people, seeing their real stories and lives behind the numbers and contracts. The work with the foundation became not just a task, but a purpose in his life. Now, every time Richard thought about that book he had thrown away so many years ago, he no longer felt guilt as he once had. Instead, he saw it as a symbol of opportunity, an opportunity for him to rethink his life and do something bigger. The book became a reminder that even the smallest actions could have a tremendous impact on others, and this realization became his new guiding principle in life.